Oh, here it is.
Good evening, everyone. We've got a few more folks coming on.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone, for keeping yourselves on mute, except when you're asking questions. We want to make sure to keep the sound flowing as best as it can. But we'll give it one more minute and then.
Whose phone number is that?
Someone good, Alice.
Is that your number?
I have no idea.
Hey, Rebbe.
Yeah.
I assume you already have one?
Wait, who said Rebbe? Was that Yosela?
Yeah. Who else
Where
called
are-
you Rebbe?
Where are you, Yosela?
I'm in the bedroom with Lucy.
Ashanda.
I meant more on my Zoom screen, but hi, Joe. Oh,
Those her
I'm in
legs?
sunny Florida.
yes.
Black.
That might have to be a story, Joe. I meant that spiritually. Where are you? Where are you?
Spiritually?
Hanani.
I'm
That's
just
where he
messing
is.
around now.
He's in Hanani. He can answer Hanani.
Wonderful. I like that presence.
Okay, here you
Ani Po.
Wonderful. So enough tomfoolery. And, it's wonderful to have Dr. Koplow back with us today. Although what I said to him when I saw him before we let everyone in is, it's wonderful to see Dr. Koplow, though not under these circumstances. We're here tonight and we had this last minute briefing because obviously we're all deeply concerned about the conflagration that is happening in Israel, the terrible violence. And we all, please, again, everyone, please keep yourselves on mute unless you're asking a question. There are a lot of moving pieces. There are a lot of unknowns. And so we thought we'd go right to the experts. So many of you have learned from Dr. Koplow. Some of you have not yet done so. So just a brief introduction. Michael Koplow is the policy director of the Israel Policy Forum. Before coming to the IPF, he was the founding program director of the Israel Institute. He has a PhD in government from Georgetown University, where he specialized in political development and ideology, as well as the politics of Middle Eastern states. He writes the Israel Policy Forum's weekly, brilliantly named Koplow column, and edits the Israel Policy Exchange, which is a leading source for commentary and analysis on Israel and American Jewry, and his work regularly appears in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, The Atlantic, and The Forward, among other publications.
Thank you.
So in addition to his PhD, he has a BA from Brandeis. Oh, I was just outside Brandeis on Monday, by the way. A JD from NYU and an AM in Middle Eastern Studies from Harvard. So Dr. Koplow has kept very busy. So without further ado, Dr. Koplow, the stage.
Thank you, Rabbi. Notwithstanding the circumstances, it's always great to see you, and it's always great to see everybody from B'nai Abraham. So there's obviously a lot going on. So I'll try to break it down. And there are really three separate crises that are taking place that have all come to a head at the same time. And I'll talk about each of them separately, and at the end we can talk a little bit about how some of them are linked. And then, of course, as always, I'm happy to answer any questions people have or really talk about anything that people want to talk about. So the first crisis that is going on is a crisis having to do with Jerusalem. And this is something that has been simmering for a long time for a number of reasons. I'll start with, and even within the Jerusalem piece of this, there are a number of different components. I'll start with the piece that had been in the news a lot, and that is the pending evictions of Palestinian families in a neighborhood called Sheikh Jarrah. For those of you who are familiar with Jerusalem geography, Sheikh Jarrah is a neighborhood that is a bit beyond the Green Line, sort of northeast of the old city. In Hebrew, it is called Shimon HaTzadik because it is where the tomb of Shimon HaTzadik, a famous high priest from the Second Temple period, his tomb is believed to be there. And so if you ever go through Sheikh Jarrah, you will see lots of Haredi, ultra-Orthodox Jews who are going to the tomb of Shimon HaTzadik, and you will see many Palestinians because it is largely a Palestinian neighborhood. Now, there were a number of Jewish trusts that owned property in Sheikh Jarrah before 1948. During the 1948 war, when Jordan captured East Jerusalem and occupied that part of the city, the Jews who lived there, of course, fled. And there was a Jordanian governmental body that gave out the property, Jewish homes, to Palestinians. And in Sheikh Jarrah in particular, it was given out to Palestinian refugees who themselves had either fled or been expelled from Israel and were now living in Jordanian-controlled Jerusalem. When Israel recaptured Sheikh Jarrah in 1967, you now have these Palestinian families that had been resettled there in the 1950s by the Jordanian government. And in 1968, and then amended in 1970, the Knesset passed a law that provided for Jews who could prove that they owned property in East Jerusalem before 1948. This law provided that they could go to court to reclaim those properties if they could present proof that they own them. So we're talking about British land deeds and Ottoman land deeds. And that set the stage for what's going on now. There were these two trusts that had owned property in Sheikh Jarrah. They went and they demonstrated they owned the property. Initially, the Israeli court threw out the case because of an agreement between, I don't need to get too into the weeds, but because of an agreement between Jordan and the UN. And then what happened next was these trusts decided to file civil suits against the Palestinians living in these properties. They came to an agreement with the Palestinian families, critically, not all of them, I think 17 out of the 23 families in question, where the families agreed to pay the original Jewish landowners rent in return for staying there. And as a result of that agreement, there's now this precedent been set. And since then, Israeli courts have said that if you can prove that you own the property, if you're a Jew and you can prove you own the property, then you can try to reclaim it. And so this case over these Sheikh Jarrah houses has been going on for years. Some people may remember, may be familiar with the fact that at this point, I think it's maybe even over a decade, there have been weekly Friday protests in Sheikh Jarrah by Palestinians who are on the verge of being evicted from these homes that were owned by Jews before 1948. And coincidentally, the hearing on these evictions, because the two organizations that are asserting property rights to these homes in Sheikh Jarrah, they're now looking to evict the Palestinians living there and let Jews move in. The hearing before the Israeli High Court on whether these evictions could go forward had been scheduled for this past Monday, 2 days ago. So this has been building up for a while. And as the hearing date has gotten closer, it has become a bigger issue, both in Israel and in the international community. People may have seen members of Congress tweeting about it over the past few weeks. There have been letters from members of Congress. There have been statements from different international actors about the evictions in Sheikh Jarrah. So this has been on its own kind of coming to a head and increasing tensions in Jerusalem. Separately from that, there have been a series of clashes between Palestinians and far-right Jewish nationalists in Jerusalem, and this has been going on now for a little over a month. People may have seen in the news about a month ago that there were a series of attacks by Palestinians on ultra-Orthodox Jews in Jerusalem that were then posted to TikTok. In response, an organization called Lehava, which is really, it's sort of the Israeli Jewish equivalent for the KKK. It's a Jewish supremacist organization. among the things that it believes is that it should be illegal for Jews and non-Jews to have sexual relations. It should be illegal for Jews and non-Jews to marry. This organization organized a march through the streets of downtown Jerusalem, where they clashed with Palestinians who were gathered outside the old city. The police had to come in. There were riots on both sides. None of the Lahava rioters was arrested, but a number of Palestinians were arrested. And those clashes have continued off and on now for weeks. In addition, this month is Ramadan. And during Ramadan, you have an influx of Palestinians, sometimes from the West Bank, but also from northern Israel, where you have many Palestinian citizens of Israel. You have an influx of them into Jerusalem, going to Al-Aqsa for Ramadan. And the Israeli government this year on Ramadan or actually the Israeli police this year on Ramadan did a few things that were unprecedented. One of those things was closing off the steps around Damascus Gate, Shar Shechem. I don't know if people have spent time around Shar Shechem. I find that oftentimes it's a place that American Jews and frankly many Israeli Jews aren't familiar with because it's one of the gates into the Muslim quarter, and American Jews tend to know Jaffa Gate well and Zion Gate well, Damascus Gate less well. But if you know Damascus Gate, it's sort of sunk, and there's a series of steps that surround Damascus Gate, sort of almost like in an amphitheater. And during Ramadan, this is kind of the big public place in East Jerusalem for Palestinians where they go after iftar, after they break the fast, and they kind of hang out on the steps, and people give out candy, and there's music and all that. This year, for whatever reason, the Jerusalem police decided they were going to close down those steps during Ramadan, and so that right away caused a lot of tension with Palestinians who were either residents of East Jerusalem or who were coming to East Jerusalem for Ramadan. In addition, there was an incident on the Temple Mount where the Israeli police cut the power to the loudspeakers that are used to broadcast the call to prayer. Why this was done is not clear, but it was done. And that caused a lot of tension as well. And so you have this combination of the Sheikh Jarrah issue and the clashes that were already going on between Palestinian radical youth and radical Jewish supremacists, and Ramadan all coming to a head at the same time. And then on top of that, Monday was also Yom Yerushalayim, Jerusalem Day, the day that celebrates the reunification of Jerusalem. And over the past 15 years or so, Yom Yerushalayim has really become less of a celebration about the reunification of Jerusalem and much more of a day that is really seized upon by right-wing nationalists to not only celebrate the reunification of Jerusalem, but to sort of assert Jewish rights and only Jewish rights in Jerusalem. And one of the things that happens is a march called the Flag March that goes through Damascus Gate, through the Muslim quarter. It's time to do so that people get to the Western Wall at dawn, in time for Shacharit, in time for morning prayers at dawn. And it's done through the Muslim quarter with kind of lots of noise and flag waving, and in a way that is really designed to sort of throw it in the residents of the Muslim quarter's faces. I'll say when I was 18 and spending a year in yeshiva in Israel, I participated in this march, kind of not really necessarily knowing what it was about. And in subsequent years, it has gotten larger and rowdier. So all of this kind of came to a head at the same time, and so you had these huge tensions over Jerusalem. Now, as you had these tensions over Jerusalem, obviously this was becoming, as I noted, more and more of an issue, not only among Palestinian residents of Jerusalem, but among Palestinians writ large. And of course, Jerusalem is a big issue within Palestinian society. It's it's sort of the one thing that unites everybody, because Jerusalem is, much as it is for Jews, not only a religious site and a religious symbol, but also a political symbol. And so, you had signs of discontent and protest in the West Bank and Gaza as well. And this leads now to crisis number 2, which is the current fighting between Israel and Hamas. And to understand really what's going on here, you have to keep in mind the Jerusalem piece, but it's also important to understand what has taken place in Palestinian politics over the past month. The Palestinians, for the first time in 15 years, had scheduled elections, and they were supposed to have 3 rounds of elections. The first one was going to be elections for the Palestinian parliament, and those were scheduled to take place on May 22nd. Now, Palestinians initially, given that there have not been Palestinian legislative elections since 2006, initially were skeptical that these would happen, and there was widespread support for Palestinian elections, while at the same time, Palestinian polling showed that Palestinians did not think they were going to happen. And as momentum toward elections increased, and as different parties submitted their parliamentary lists, what you saw in Palestinian polling was a huge jump, actually, over the course of only about a month. The number of Palestinians who thought that elections were actually going to take place went up from, I think the number was 31% up to something like 65%. Palestinians actually thought they were going to happen, and they were excited about it. And a few things happened. The first thing that happened was that in the polling, it was unclear whether Fatah, which is the main component of the Palestinian Authority and the party that is controlled by Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, it was unclear if Fatah was actually going to defeat Hamas in the legislative elections. As you might imagine, polling of Palestinians is tricky. It's particularly tricky in Gaza. And so, there was some evidence that Fatah was going to squeak out a win. There was some evidence that Fatah would win in Gaza, where they are not, and that Hamas would win in the West Bank, where they are not, because people don't really like, people tend to not like their governments. But it certainly didn't seem as if this was in the bag for Fatah. And then what happened was the fact that Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, has been in power for so long and in a blatantly anti-democratic faction means that you have lots of people within Fatah who are not happy with Abbas and who think that there needs to be real reform. And so Fatah itself, which had hoped to run one unified list, because this is the problem they faced in 2006 when Hamas ran one list and Fatah fractured and Hamas won the parliamentary elections in 2006. The idea was this time, let's avoid that, let's have one Fatah list. The discontent with Abbas prevented that. And so what you had was one Fatah parliamentary list that was headed by Abbas, one Fatah parliamentary list that was headed by Nasser al-Kidwa, who is Yasser Arafat's nephew and the former Palestinian ambassador to the UN, a very well-known Palestinian figure, headed by him, and jointly him and Marwan Barghouti, who is probably the most popular Palestinian political figure alive today. He is in Israeli prison serving, I think it's 7 consecutive life sentences for his role in orchestrating suicide bombings during the Second Intifada. And then you had a third list that was run by Mohammed Dahlan. Mohammed Dahlan is a former Fatah security chief in Gaza. He is Mahmoud Abbas's nemesis. He is his top rival within Fatah. Mahmoud Abbas basically exiled Dahlan a few years ago. Dahlan has been living for almost a decade now in the United Arab Emirates, where he is very close to Mohammed bin Zayed, the crown prince of the UAE. And Abbas has basically purged all of Dahlan's supporters from Fatah. Dahlan, though, has kind of been making a comeback. He's very popular, particularly in Gaza, particularly in refugee camps. Dahlan himself was born in a refugee camp in Gaza. And because he is in the UAE, he also has access to UAE money, and he's been using that to kind of spread around the West Bank to try to build support. So you had these 3 Fatah lists. And once that happened, then it was clear that at that point, Fatah had no way at all of winning elections. Abbas did what everybody knew he was going to do, which was he postponed elections indefinitely. And that was something that was unpopular among Palestinians, but particularly unpopular with Hamas, who had been consistently saying, no, 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 let's have elections, understanding that they were operating from a position of strength. So with that backdrop in mind, what you have is Hamas looking at events in Jerusalem and saying, we have a chance to not only capitalize on this idea that we are the defenders of Jerusalem, but also capitalize on the fact that Fatah at this point is probably as weak as they have ever been during Mahmoud Abbas's presidency. And so Fatah decided to use Ramadan and use the Sheikh Jarrah pending evictions and use these perceived threats to the Temple Mount. And on Monday, Hamas said, we are issuing the Israeli government an ultimatum. If you don't clear out of Sheikh Jarrah entirely and you don't remove all police from the Temple Mount, we are going to start shooting rockets at Israel, which is what they did. And they had set a time to do it. And they started by shooting rockets at Jerusalem, which is extremely unusual. And we've all kept on top of the news. We're now more than 48 hours later, and this has continued. We're now up to something like 1,500 rockets that have been shot. And they have not been confined to the Gaza periphery, which is generally what happens. They have, certainly been shot there, but they've also been shot at Tel Aviv. About 3 hours ago, there were rockets that reached as far north in Israel as the Jezreel Valley in Nachal Al, which is also that's unprecedented. Hamas's rocket ranges have never been quite that far, and so this is a serious escalation. And certainly Hamas doesn't need an excuse to shoot rockets at Israelis. We've seen this movie, unfortunately, many times before. But in this instance, as funny as it sounds, it's not actually directed primarily at Israel. Hamas doesn't at this point actually want anything tangible from Israel they think they can get. This is much more of a play to destabilize the West Bank and to try to topple Fatah, because what Hamas wants is for in response to the rockets on Israel, and then in response to Israel conducting retaliatory strikes in Gaza, what Hamas wants is to spark a popular uprising in the West Bank and basically take advantage of the fact that Fatah right now is deeply unpopular and deeply weak. That's what they're aiming for. And whether they're successful or not, we'll see. But that's what they're aiming for. The one thing I'll say, kind of on this before we move on to crisis number 3, is that right now it is obviously not quiet in Gaza. It's not quiet inside of Israel either, which I'll get to in a moment. The one place where it is quiet is the West Bank, because the Palestinian Authority has a very competent and professional security force that has been trained and equipped by the United States, that coordinates with the IDF, is effectively a counter-terrorist partner of the IDF, not because they're Zionists, but because neither Israel nor Fatah wants to see Hamas get a foothold in the West Bank. And so far the West Bank has been quiet, and that means that the PA security forces are doing their jobs. How long that continues, it's very hard to say. But it's been I'll say I'll say in my first and maybe only editorial comment of the night, it's been bizarre to see comments and tweets from Israeli officials, including the Israeli ambassador to the United States, Gilad Erdan, that have explicitly blamed the Palestinian Authority and Mahmoud Abbas for the unrest and for violence, when the one place that is quiet right now is the West Bank, and that's not because of the Israelis. That's at the moment because of the PA. So let's go to crisis number 3. Crisis number 3, and I have to tell you, this is the one that actually I'm the most worried about, and I think is the most serious, and that will have the longest impact, is what is starting to look like a civil war inside of Israel between Jewish citizens of Israel and Arab citizens of Israel. And this is much more related to crisis number 1 and the issues over Jerusalem than it is to what's going on between Hamas and Israel. It isn't only West Bank Palestinians or Gazan Palestinians who are sensitive to issues around Jerusalem and the Temple Mount. Obviously, Israeli Arabs are sensitive to that as well, in some ways more so because they have constant access to the Temple Mount, as opposed to West Bank Palestinians whose access there is limited. And so on the one hand, you've had this move that's been taking place now, particularly over the last 2 election cycles, to greater integrate Israeli Arabs and Israeli Arab political parties into Israeli politics. And you have, Mansour Abbas, who's the head of the Ra'am party, the Islamist Israeli Arab party that got 4 seats in the most recent election. You have Ra'am literally holding coalition negotiations with both sides, first with Prime Minister Netanyahu when he had the mandate, and now with Yair Lapid and Naftali Bennett, because Lapid has the mandate. And you really, for the first time, had this very good chance that there was going to be an Israeli government that actually included an Israeli Arab party. And this is revolutionary in a good way, but it's revolutionary. As that's been going on, you've had this churn over Jerusalem and the Temple Mount. And as things literally exploded on Monday, there were mobs of Israeli Arabs, young Israeli Arabs, who have been inflamed over the Jerusalem issue, literally carrying out riots inside of mixed cities inside of Israel. So places where you have both Jewish and Arab populations. Places, we've seen attention in Jerusalem, as I mentioned, but places like Lod, places like Akko, places like Ramla, places like Haifa. And so in Lod, there were literally mobs marching around, burning synagogues and stores and cars. And then you had retaliatory Jewish mobs who were going out, stopping cars. If it was driven by a Jew, letting them pass. If it was driven by an Arab, stoning the car. You had Jewish property burned in Akko, a very famous restaurant that is sort of that's famously a symbol in Akko because it employs half Jews and half Arabs. That was burned. I mean, literally a symbol of coexistence. Today, there have been 2 attempted lynchings, one of a Jew by an Arab mob, one of an Arab by a Jewish mob. This is very, very bad. I don't think I have to kind of impress upon people why this is very bad. And not only is it about to undo this idea that Israeli Arabs were, for the first time, about to really enter Israeli politics and about to really become part of the discourse. And this was something that Israeli Arabs wanted and something that Israeli Jews were kind of coming around to accept. Not only is that going to set that back entirely, what's going on now looks like what the pre-state period looked like in the years leading up to 1948. There have been periods, particularly during the Second Intifada, when you had Israeli Arab riots. Mostly those were directed against the police. They were not riots targeting their Israeli Jewish neighbors. And what you have now, unfortunately, on both sides, is gangs literally roaming the streets, looking for someone from the other ethnicity to hurt and to kill. And that's what the pre-state period looked like. And I can't express enough how concerning this should be to everybody and what it's going to do to the fabric of Israeli society. Because it's one thing for Israel to have to deal with rockets from Gaza and terrorism coming from the West Bank. It's a whole other thing to have to deal with a potential civil war pitting Israeli citizen against Israeli citizen. And remember that somewhere between 22 and 25% of Israeli citizens are Israeli Arab. We're talking about 1 out of every 4 Israelis. And so if this is something that is not nipped in the bud and that spreads, there's really no telling where it ends, and kind of there's no telling what the limit of the damage can be. So these are the 3 things that are happening right now. I think some of them are more easily resolved than others, but it's very worrisome, and everybody should keep the residents of the Holy Land in mind, because I think that everybody, Jews, Arabs, Palestinians are in for another rough few weeks. So with that sobering note, I am happy to take any questions people have. Rabbi, I don't know if you want to kind of moderate this.
Thank you. I know there are a lot of questions to be asked, and so I would ask that you please type your questions into the chat to be able to keep it most organized. If you are on a phone and unable to do so, if there's a way to raise your hand, then we can do that as well. But please do so using the Zoom function because we may not see you. That's really the only way to make sure that everyone gets their fair chance tonight. Thank you. So first, we have a question from Bennett and Honey. Where is Hamas getting all the rockets from? Russians, Iran?
Good question. Not the Russians. The Russians are not involved in this. So many of the Hamas rockets, particularly the ones that get shot to the Gaza periphery, are as crude as can be. They're basically metal casings with some sort of explosive, and they don't have a very long range. Part of the problem actually that Israel has had in dealing with rockets over the years is that Iron Dome is a pretty effective system. Over the past few days, the estimates are that Iron Dome has hit 90% of the targets it was supposed to intercept, which is amazing. It can't really deal with rockets that have a range of less than 3 miles, and many of the Hamas rockets that get shot at the Gaza periphery, places like Nahal Oz and Sderot and other Netiv HaSara have this range of just 2.5 to 3 miles, and Iron Dome can't really deal with it. So a lot of them are they're not being supplied by anybody. Basically, if you have metal and you have some sort of explosive, you can make a crude rocket. And part of the reason that you see relatively few Israeli casualties is part of it is Iron Dome, of course. Part of it is the fact that these are crude rockets with no guidance and no real way to control them, and so they just tend to land anywhere. And oftentimes that is, particularly around the Gaza periphery, oftentimes that is in empty fields or uninhabited areas. But as I mentioned before, what we're seeing this time are longer range Palestinian rockets, and those are also made inside, largely made inside of Gaza. It's I don't want to say relatively easy, but it's not as hard as one would imagine to smuggle things into Gaza. There is an Israeli blockade, but it's hard to enforce a full naval blockade. There are smuggling tunnels under the border with Egypt. The Egyptians try to crack down on that as much as they can, but stuff is smuggled in. And then there are things that are called dual-use items. You think about even in the United States, right, where I remember a few years ago there was a big problem that copper wiring and copper gutters were being stolen from people's houses because the price of copper was so high, and people were just taking copper to repurpose it for other things. You can imagine how difficult it is to keep any metal of any sort out of Gaza, right? You just think about how many things have metal, buildings, cars, for starters, So, and frankly, almost anything in the world that isn't an agricultural product can be a dual-use item. So it's functionally impossible unless you want to have Gaza resemble literally a Stone Age village. It's impossible to keep all metal and all dual-use items out of Gaza. And remember, Gaza is run by a terrorist organization that is not accountable to anybody. And so, nobody's going to stop. There's nobody with the capability to stop Hamas from kind of going around Gaza and taking whatever materials they want to make rockets. So, certainly, I'm sure that much of the smuggling is done with Iranian help and complicity, but much of this stuff is kind of homegrown inside of Gaza.
Great. Another question from Dan Collin. Do Arabs have similar rights to reclaim land that they owned before 1948 and land that is now occupied by Jewish people?
No, they do not. And this is one of the things that I'll say has been missed in much of the commentary around this issue. You'll see a lot of commentary around the Sheikh Jarrah issue, including from the Israeli government in recent weeks, that says something like, this is a private legal dispute between private parties, and so it's unclear why anybody's commenting. Yes, that is technically true. It is a private legal dispute between one party that asserts that it has ownership rights and another party that says that it has rights because it's been living in the properties, and there is a private dispute about whether rent has been paid or not. But all that has only been enabled by this 1968 law, which grants Jews and only Jews the right to reclaim property from before 1948. Now, it shouldn't escape anyone's notice that what this effectively is a right of return for Jews and only Jews in East Jerusalem. There is no corresponding right of return for Palestinians who owned property in West Jerusalem, places that we're probably all familiar with, Baka and Talbia, which are not Hebrew words. Those neighborhoods are named as such because those were big Arab neighborhoods of West Jerusalem before 1948. There is no right for Palestinians who had homes there to reclaim property, even if they have the same Ottoman and British land deeds as the Jews who are reclaiming property in Sheikh Jarrah. So, perhaps there are ways to justify this. There are people who say, them's the breaks. Israel's a Jewish state. Israel won in 1948. Israel won in 1967. That's kind of the consequence of if you're Palestinian of losing multiple wars against Israel. On the other hand, it's difficult to talk about how there can be no right of return for Palestinians when you've granted the same thing for Jews in East Jerusalem. So whatever your feelings are on this, it is important to note that this is not just a private legal dispute. There is very much a public policy component to this.
So from David Rocker, what do you think is the best way to calm this situation? And given the state of the Israeli government, what do you expect will be done?
What's happened in the past is, every time this has happened since 2014, the last time this happened, there were, I think, 500 rockets shot in about 24 hours in 2018, as people might recall. What happens is these volleys go off, the Israelis respond, and then some combination of the Egyptians, because they have sway, they can obviously talk to both the Israelis and Hamas, and they have sway with Hamas. Some combination of the Egyptians in the United States and the United Nations step in, broker a ceasefire, and this formula of quiet for quiet gets restored, which is kind of what has been the formula since 2014. This time around, Israel views Hamas as having broken the basic rules of the game that both sides, have allegedly understand have reigned since 2014, both in terms of shooting rockets at Jerusalem, in terms of the range of rockets, in terms of the quantity of rockets, in terms of the capacity of these rockets. So the Israeli government seems pretty determined right now to really deal Hamas a blow that will set it back, not just in a way that they can kind of rest on their heels and quickly recover. I think they're looking to really deal Hamas a much more serious blow this time. And what that means is that this is going to go on for longer than I think we've been accustomed to over the past 7 years. There is talk about Israeli ground forces going to Gaza, something that there's really no appetite in the IDF to do. I think that the longer this goes on, the greater the chances of that increase, not just because of the length, but because at some point Israel is going to run out of viable targets from the air. And if you want to, at that point, deal Hamas a real blow, there's kind of no way around actually going into Gaza. And I think that probably today, maybe tomorrow, we're kind of, either we reached or we're about to reach a tipping point where the choices for Israel are to kind of dial things back and engage in ceasefire talks, or ramp things up. Because as I said, the current MO of just airstrikes, I don't think it can last much longer, because targets are going to be exhausted. So I think this is going to go on for longer. Hadi Amr, who is the top US official on this file, flew over today, and he will no doubt be working with the Israeli government and with the Egyptians, and probably with the Qataris, who also have more influence with Hamas than anybody else. And I'll note that Secretary Blinken had a conversation today with the Qatari foreign minister, and I'm certain that's what it was about. The U.S. will be working with all these parties to try to de-escalate things and quiet things down. But I don't think that I don't think this is going to end in the next day or two. Unfortunately, I think that Israel wants to accomplish some more things in Gaza, and frankly, as long as Hamas is shooting rockets in the frequency that they are, and even as we've been sitting here over the past 40 minutes, there've been more rockets going off. There's no expectation that this is going to end anytime soon. So that's it's a pessimistic take, but I don't think that the old formula is going to work, where this ends after a day or two, with U.S. and Egyptian intervention.
And so that answers crisis number two, I believe. What about
Yes.
crisis number 1 and crisis number 3?
So crisis number 1, the Israeli Supreme Court, very wisely at the request of the Attorney General, postponed the Sheikh Jarrah hearing on Monday. Kind of went down to the wire, and it was postponed. Ramadan ends this week, and so hopefully that will quiet things down. We're obviously past Yom Yerushalayim. So the hope is that in Jerusalem itself, the real crisis point has been reached, and we're past it. Now, there are plenty of ways for this to continue. The Kahanists followers, who populate Lehava and other organizations, and who have been urged on by Itamar Ben-Gvir, one of the newest Knesset members, who is the head of the Otzma Yehudit Jewish Power Party. They have an interest in continuing this, and I don't think that calming tempers among Palestinian youth in East Jerusalem is going to be that easy. But hopefully we are past the crisis point there. Number 3 is, as I said, really, really difficult. The Israeli government declared a state of emergency in the city of Lod yesterday, which is where kind of the worst fighting has been. But if anybody has seen the videos coming out today, and I was spending some time today just with the live feed of Israeli news channel Khan on my computer, and you're on social media. Journalists have been posting pretty horrific videos on Twitter of mobs back and forth, literally pulling people out of cars or off of scooters and attempting to lynch them. The police have kind of been just standing around, and there isn't a great answer. If it were me, and this is far from my area of expertise, I have no expertise in policing or security, or kind of this kind of security or crowd control tactics. If it were me, I probably would have declared a general curfew days ago, and had the police out in force to really enforce it. That has not happened. And one of the other problems, and this has cropped up a lot in the past, and I alluded to it earlier when I talked about the street battle that happened between Lehava and Palestinians a few weeks ago. The Israeli police tend, in these situations, to arrest the Palestinians and kind of yell at the Jews and tell them to go home. And in this situation, that's just not going to work. And I think that until and unless the police are willing to do what has to be done on both sides, I'm not sure that this is going to get under control, unfortunately. So, as I said, 3 is the most worrisome, and I also think it's the hardest to solve.
So now from David Solomon, how will Hezbollah react/respond to the events taking place, and will the international community have any impact on the outcome? You've mentioned Egypt and Qatar, but what about everyone else?
People have been watching this very carefully, understandably, because the biggest proximate threat to Israel for over a decade now has been Hezbollah rockets in Lebanon, and the attempt to kind of replicate the Hezbollah situation inside of Syria with Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. At the moment, Hezbollah seems to be holding off. There's a lot of evidence that Hezbollah has been pretty well deterred dating back to 2006. There's also a lot of evidence that Hezbollah has been kind of chastened by a very successful Israeli program over the past 3 years to strike at weapon shipments going across Syria to Hezbollah. There have been hundreds of Israeli strikes targeting Hezbollah operatives and Hezbollah weapons that are marked for Hezbollah. So far Hezbollah has not gotten involved. The question is always to what extent Hezbollah operates in any way independently from Iran. Hezbollah is certainly an Iranian proxy, but they don't quite take orders directly from Iran. There seems to be at times some distance. So even if the Iranians were to say to Hezbollah, go shoot rockets now, it's not clear whether Hezbollah would kind of feel compelled to do it if they didn't think it was in their own direct interest. The other factor here is that so long as Iran is still negotiating with the United States and the international community over JCPOA, and Iran wants to, they want to figure out a way, to get back into it because they want sanctions removed. It's difficult for me to see a situation in which the Iranians want Hezbollah to completely engulf the region in flames. If that happens, not only are all bets off on JCPOA or removing any type of Iranian sanctions, at that point, Iran is also opening itself up to the far likelier possibility of military strikes inside Iran by Israel. So my bet is that Hezbollah sits this out, but that's I wouldn't be putting a lot of money on. I think that's the likelihood, but it's very hard to say. As I said, I think that sort of the confluence of interest at the moment probably weigh against them being involved.
So I think this is answered, but I'm wondering if you have anything to add to Joe's question or statement. I've spoken to 4 families in Israel this week. All of them feel that this war has been going on for 200 years and the riots and missiles come every few years. They believe that this will pass and are not taking it as seriously as I am. Thoughts?
I think that I think it's reasonable for Israelis to conclude, not just Israelis, I think it's reasonable for any of us to conclude that at some point in the next few days, the rockets from Gaza will stop. And as I said, we've seen this particular movie before, even if some of the details this time are different. But if the Hamas program of trying to inflame the West Bank is successful, then this is not just going to go away. And as I said, the riots taking place inside of Israel proper is certainly unprecedented. Since 1948. And the other problem is that it's always very easy to assume that kind of the status quo reigns until all of a sudden it doesn't, right? Nobody predicted or foresaw the Second Intifada, and when the Second Intifada broke out, plenty of people thought this is a temporary spasm of violence, and it went on for 4 years. So I'm always cautious of just assuming that what we've seen in the past is what's going to happen, what's going to necessarily happen in the future, and that there's some sort of equilibrium here. There has been an equilibrium, but Hamas has very clearly broken it in terms of the Israel-Gaza equilibrium over the last few days. And the equilibrium in the West Bank, I cannot stress this enough, is entirely dependent on Mahmoud Abbas remaining in power, because whatever you think of Abbas and and his role in rejecting various Israeli peace offers, there is no debate over the fact that Abbas has embraced nonviolence, and has really imposed it on the Palestinian Authority. And whether he's a partner for peace or not, he is certainly a partner for nonviolence, and he is the one who has effectively ensured that the PA security forces do their jobs in a professional way. When Abbas is gone, the kind of equilibrium that we've all become used to in the West Bank, that will be gone. All bets will be off. There will almost certainly be a Palestinian war of succession. Whoever replaces Abbas is going to have an incentive to kind of ramp up the nationalist rhetoric and actions. I think that you often hear Israeli security officials talk about the fact that that Israel has kind of missed this opportunity with Abbas, and that everybody's going to miss him when he's gone. I can guarantee you, everybody, whatever you think of Abbas today, everybody is going to miss Abbas when he's gone. And the equilibrium in the West Bank is very fragile, and really rests at the moment on the health of an 86 or 87-year-old chain smoker who has had multiple bouts with cancer in the past few years. And that should worry everybody. Even if you think that the rocket situation from Gaza is something that will be taken care of and will be restored.
I was very nervous before, but that news of him being a chain smoker, that's
for years, very, very brief anecdote, for years in meetings with foreign officials, and everybody kind of knows this is what happens, you can't really smoke anymore, even if you're Mahmoud Abbas, when you're meeting with foreign diplomats. And so there's kind of this game where after 30 minutes, somebody comes in and says, Mr. Rais, you have an urgent phone call in the next room, and he goes out so that he can take a smoke break. So, yeah.
It's good to have a tiny bit of levity in this, right?
Right.
Okay, so now from Joe, President Biden has sent a US politician to calm down the Israelis and the PLO. What good is negotiating with the PLO when Hamas is doing damage with the rockets?
So you just to get facts straight, so he hasn't sent a politician. He has sent the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Israeli and Palestinian Affairs. And it isn't to engage with the PLO. As I said, the West Bank is quiet. The PLO has no role in this at the moment, and Hamas is not a member of the PLO as much as they would like to be. What Deputy Assistant Secretary Hadi Amar is going to do, I think, as I mentioned before, is he's going to go. He's going to sit down with the Egyptians and the UN Special Coordinator. And together they are going to figure out a plan whereby the US is probably going to interface mostly with the Israelis. The Egyptians are going to interface with Hamas. The UN is probably going to talk to the Qataris and other Arab states, and they'll come up with a joint plan of action to try and get this de-escalated and get a ceasefire in place. As I mentioned before, I have my grave doubts as to whether this is going to be successful, certainly in the next couple of days. And I think that, on top of that, one of the problems here is that, particularly on the Israeli side, the Israeli government is used to dealing with the Secretary of State, or kind of a very high-profile special envoy for Israeli-Palestinian peace. Whether it's George Mitchell or Martin Indyk or or Dennis Ross, kind of big, well-known names that everybody knows. At the moment, there is no envoy, and as capable as Hadi Amar is, and I'll say, just to reveal my biases, he's both a close friend and a good colleague, and I've worked with him very closely over the past few years on different projects, and very smart, very capable, and I'm not sure that I've met anybody who actually cares as deeply as he does about real peace and coexistence between both sides in the Holy Land. Ultimately, the Israelis are going to look at him and say, "You're a deputy assistant secretary of state. Can't be that important." And so I do worry that we, the U.S., aren't necessarily bringing the necessary force to bear that we have here. And when I say force, I don't mean in terms of consequences. I mean, in terms of making it clear that we are invested in trying to restore quiet. And I'm certain that Hadi is going to do the best job that he possibly can. But I do worry that ultimately we may need kind of a higher U.S. government official to step in, particularly if Hamas is ready to play ball, but the Israelis want a little more time.
So to follow up, what role this is from Amos Gurn, what role can and should the U.S. State Department have, do you think, in abating this crisis? Will the Biden administration get the needed respect of the Israeli government in helping to mediate the parties?
Yeah, so as I said, I do worry about that. There was also a what was reported to be a bit of an unpleasant exchange last week between our National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and the Israeli National Security Advisor Meir Ben Shabbat, where they had a call. This was before Monday, so it was before rockets. They had a call about the tensions in Jerusalem and particularly about Sheikh Jarrah. And what was reported was that Meir Ben Shabbat told Jake Sullivan, in a not terribly friendly manner, none of your business, but out. The U.S. should have nothing to say here, and you should just leave us to do what we're going to do. And that complicates things because obviously it doesn't set a great precedent in terms of Israeli willingness to listen to the U.S. at the moment, but it also doesn't set a great precedent because there have also been lots of reporting over the past couple of days that 14 out of 15 Security Council members had agreed on the language of a statement about what's going on, and the U.S. stepped in and won't let it go forward because they don't want any criticism at the moment of Israel at the UN. So, on the one hand, you have the Israeli government saying to the U.S., "This is none of your business. This is entirely our business. Leave us alone." On the other hand, you have the Israeli government asking the U.S. and relying on the U.S., not only to protect it at the UN, but to kind of speak on its behalf with the Egyptians and the UN in terms of ceasefire efforts. So I think there's probably a lot more tension behind the scenes right now than is useful, and that should be concerning as well.
I want to jump to another question from Ruth Ross, and then I'll go back to the other ones. This is now to go to Jerusalem. And looking at what the police did, not only in terms of, I'm adding to Ruth's question, not only what the police did in cutting the power, but also simply in going into Al-Aqsa. So Ruth wrote, wasn't what the police did at the mosque provocation? Why would they do those things except to inflame the Palestinians?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and the answer is difficult. I mentioned the loudspeaker issue, and I mentioned Damascus Gate. People have probably also seen the footage of Israeli tear gas canisters inside of Al-Aqsa, and it's not clear whether those were canisters that were shot at Palestinians who were riding kind of on the plaza, or if it was actually shot inside the mosque itself. But obviously, this is not great imagery if you want to calm things down, and that doesn't that's not in any way to excuse. People have probably also seen the footage of stones kind of being stockpiled in Al-Aqsa, which are used to throw at the police and sometimes to throw down onto the Kotel, the Western Wall Plaza. And it's even more jarring to see the scenes of Palestinians packing Al-Aqsa on Ramadan and chanting "Bomb Tel Aviv" and with blood and fire will redeem Palestine. None of this is pleasant to see either. and it's not to absolve any of that. But when it comes to Al-Aqsa, given not only the fact that it's a religious site, but also given the fact that it is far and away the biggest flashpoint in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and potentially the biggest flashpoint in the entire Muslim community worldwide. I do think it's smarter for the Israeli police to kind of take as much of a hands-off approach as they can. It was we've seen this before. People may remember the last round of kind of real tension over Al-Aqsa, when the Israeli police, in response to an attack on 3 Israeli Druze policemen who were standing outside the entrance to the Temple Mount, Israel erected metal detectors on the Temple, at the entrance to the Temple Mount. There were literally hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who protested, and Israel, a couple of days later, backtracked and took them down. There was a similar thing happened just this month with the steps around Damascus Gate. Israel closed them. There were protests and riots, and then the police backtracked and said, "Okay, we're going to open up." And there have been lots of reports, which is also not uncommon in any way, that the IDF and the Shin Bet, the General Security Service, have been telling the police, you shouldn't be doing these things, and the police do them anyway, and then they backtrack. So my conclusion from all this is, as I said, not to excuse the Palestinian behavior on Al-Aqsa, but given how sensitive it is, I think that it's probably smarter for the Israeli police to take a very hands-off approach and to stay away as much as possible. And tear gas inside of Al-Aqsa, whatever led to it, is just, from my point of view, not a smart way to go about things. And people can just imagine for a moment what the reaction would be to tear gas in the Western Wall Plaza on Monday, for instance, when you had lots of Jews, in front of the Kotel, dancing and cheering a fire that had broken out on a tree on Temple Mount, and singing songs taken directly from biblical verses talking about eradicating the Philistines. If Palestinian police responded to that with tear gas canisters, we would all rightly be up in arms. And I think that it's reasonable to expect Palestinians to have the same reaction.
Hey, do we have time for a few more questions? I know that we've hit.
Sure.
30.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you. First, from Earl Kalishman, do the Israeli elections play a role here?
So they do in a bit of an indirect way. Obviously, we're in this never-ending election cycle. Something I've spoken about at B'nai Abraham before. And that, by the way, Rabbi, was that a year ago? I don't even remember anymore.
I think
we're still
beginning of COVID when we realized we could bring you in by Zoom.
Right, exactly. It would have been by Zoom, so probably beginning of COVID, and we're still in it. And at the moment, obviously, Prime Minister Netanyahu had the mandate. He wasn't able to form a government. It's now gone to kind of the anti-Netanyahu bloc. There's plenty of indirect evidence, to be had that that part of the Israeli police escalation in Jerusalem over the past month, which has been directed largely by Amir Ohana, who is the Minister for Public Security and one of Netanyahu's staunchest allies and acolytes. There's plenty of evidence that a lot of this has been done, and again, as I said before, recall police actions that have gone against the recommendations of the army and the Shabak. Plenty of indirect evidence that there is an eye toward elections, right? That in general, if you want to turn out your right-wing base, that these sort of actions are popular, and that if you particularly want to prevent right-wing politicians and parties like Naftali Bennett, Gideon Sa'ar, and Yamina and Tikva Chadasha from joining a government with center and left parties, which is the negotiations that are happening now, that it's to your benefit to kind of take a strong nationalist tack and basically dare them to object. So I do think that elections are playing a role in this. but there's a conspiracy theory out there that Netanyahu has sort of engineered all of this in order to prevent the formation of a government and go to fifth elections. And that is, as far as I'm concerned, that is a conspiracy theory without any merit. So yes, elections are the backdrop, and some of that is going on, but I don't think that that is actually what's driving this directly.
Here's another question, and I think this is all of the questions are important. This one, I hear this question from a lot of folks. This is from Marina Chernin. There's been a lot of biased misinformation spread around about Israel indiscriminately and aggressively killing innocent Palestinian citizens. Is there any truth to this? I've always been told that the IDF goes out of their way to protect innocent lives, and I believe this. Am I naive?
No, I don't think that's naive, but I also think that the picture is more complex. If you look at what the IDF is doing in Gaza right now, 100%, I think it's reasonable to conclude that the IDF goes out of its way to avoid civilian casualties. From the fact that they use very targeted bombs. When they want to hit a building, it literally hits that building and only that building, and destroys that building and only that building. People have probably read about what they call knocking on the roof, where the Israeli government, or say the IDF, either kind of sends a projectile that doesn't not a bomb, sort of just makes a loud noise to warn people to leave a building before it's about to be targeted by an actual bomb, or broadcast warnings, and says, we're going to destroy this building, you've got 5 minutes to leave. The fact that the IDF has not launched a ground operation, not just this time, but in previous times, is also an effort to avoid excessive loss of life. So yes, when people talk about the IDF going out of its way to avoid civilian casualties in Gaza, and there are civilian casualties in Gaza, they do happen 100%. But I do think it's absolutely fair to say that is an accurate assessment. On the flip side, there's lots of evidence and lots of documentary evidence and lots of video evidence of IDF soldiers in other instances beating Palestinians, shooting at unarmed Palestinians, purposely aiming for Palestinian eyes with rubber bullets. There's these horrible statistics about the prevalence of Palestinians who get taken to the hospital with injuries to their eyes and lose their eyes, kind of out of proportion to what you'd expect from crowd control measures. So as I said, I think the situation is complicated. I've written about this in the past. You hear this line all the time about the IDF being the most moral army in the world. First of all, armies are not moral inherently. That's not the job of an army, frankly. But I don't know how anybody can make that claim. Armies throughout history act the way armies do, and soldiers act the way soldiers do. And the IDF, as I said, is great in Gaza about avoiding casualties, and the IDF is also very good about investigating when there are allegations and investigating its soldiers. It's also the case that oftentimes investigations don't happen until a video comes forth and then an investigation is launched. And it's oftentimes the case that an investigation is launched and a soldier is found guilty and is given the equivalent of a slap on the wrist. So it's complicated. I don't think it's accurate to say that the IDF is the most moral army in the world, because I don't know how anybody would measure that. And I don't think it's accurate to say that the IDF in all situations, always avoids innocent casualties and always protects Palestinian lives. It's simply not true. But are there very clear examples of this being the case? Yes, there are. So, there's plenty to hang your hat on in making that claim. There's also, unfortunately, plenty of counter evidence. And in general, I tend to shy away from absolutes in every situation. But certainly on this question, I run away fast from absolute statements in either direction.
Let's see. So I think one last question for the evening from Stacy Abenstein. This is always so complicated. How do you think public opinion throughout the world will affect the outcome?
I'm not sure public opinion throughout the world will matter. As I said earlier, Israel has things it wants to accomplish at the moment in Gaza vis-a-vis Hamas, and in general, it's not public opinion that really drives this stuff. It's often the opinion of governments. We do have this, as I said earlier, this concrete example of 14 Security Council members at the moment want to issue a statement at the UN. The United States does not, and that kind of stuff is what matters more than public opinion. In the long term, this kind of stuff always inflames public opinion against Israel, particularly in Europe. And so, will this have an impact on things like BDS resolutions? Undoubtedly. Will this have an impact on the debate taking place in Congress about placing usage restrictions and conditions on assistance to Israel? Undoubtedly. But public opinion isn't going to impact how these particular crises get resolved. It will impact the larger strategic milieu, and it'll impact the larger environment. But it's not gonna have an impact on kind of the day-to-day events on the ground at the moment. That's going to be determined really by the parties themselves, and whether the outside actors, again, primarily U.S., Egypt, Qatar, and the UN Special Envoy, are able to bring this to a halt.
Friends, I think this will conclude our conversation for this evening, but as I think we anticipated going into this, and as Dr. Koplow has made even more clear, we have a lot more to talk about, and there will be a lot more to unfold. So I'm sure we'll be having another briefing over the coming weeks. And in the meantime, Dr. Koplow, what is a great way for folks to reach you?
People can reach me. So first of all, I would encourage everybody to check out israelpolicyforum.org, the organization I work for. We have a wealth of resources on pretty much any topic related to Israel, but we also have a number of resources devoted to the things that we spoke about tonight, from an explainer about the issues in Sheikh Jarrah, to multiple webinars and podcasts that we've done, to pieces that I and some other colleagues have written. So I encourage everybody to check that out. And you can always find me by email. I'm mkoplow, MKOPLOW, at ipforum.org, or on Twitter at mkoplow. So really feel free to reach out anytime. And I hope that people found tonight's conversation useful and helpful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Everyone, let's give Dr. Koplow a big round of applause. And we look forward to one day being able to have you actually at Temple B'nai Abraham and give you that hospitality.
As do I.
Yeah. Max, do you want to add anything this evening?
Oh, just so great to see everyone here. And Dr. Koplow, thank you. We echo everything Rabbi Weisberg said. We'd love to have you when the time is right.
Thank you.
So thank you, everyone, and we'll continue this conversation. And if you have any friends who you think will have wanted to see this, just a reminder, starting tomorrow morning, you can email the office at TBA info.
Israeli Policy Forum.
You'll be able to email us at the office for the link for the recording. And yes, israelpolicyforum.org.
Good night, everyone.
Take care, everybody.
Good night.